In 1927, wrecking crews arrived at the corner of 5th Avenue and 57th Street in Manhattan and began tearing down the largest private residence ever built in New York City. The Vanderbilt mansion, 130 rooms, an entire city block, was reduced to rubble in a matter of months. Bergdorf Goodman now stands on that site. In the same decade, the great Newport cottages began closing their doors. The Breakers, arguably the most spectacular Gilded Age estate in America, was shuttered, its owners unable to afford the maintenance. One by one, the monuments that America's wealthiest families had built during their most extravagant era were being demolished, donated, abandoned, or sold to pay taxes. And yet, in the mountains of North Carolina, a French chateau containing 250 rooms was still standing, still owned by the family that built it, still occupied, still operating, still against every conceivable historical precedent alive. The numbers alone are difficult to absorb. 250 rooms, nearly 179,000 square feet of living space, more than 4 acres under a single roof, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, 3 kitchens, an indoor swimming pool, a bowling alley, a library that held 10,000 books. The White House has 132 rooms. Biltmore has nearly twice as many. This was built in 1895 in a mountain wilderness for one man, his books, and his dreams. To understand how Biltmore survived when everything like it disappeared, you have to understand why it was built in the first place. And the man who built it was nothing like the other Vanderbilts. Act 1. The Vanderbilt who didn't want an empire. George Washington. Vanderbilt II was born on November 14, 1862, into what was by any reasonable measure American royalty. His grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, had built his fortune on steamships and railroads, crushing competitors with a ruthlessness that shocked even the other robber barons. When the Commodore died in 1877, leaving behind a fortune of over $100 million, the equivalent of several hundred billion today, and the largest private fortune in America, at the time, the family assumed the empire would continue in his spirit. George had other plans. Or rather, George had no plans to do anything that resembled his grandfather's ambitions. If you had met him at a society party, you might not have noticed him at all. While his older brothers Cornelius and William were making headlines with their business dealings, and their wives were engaged in the exhausting competitions that defined New York's social elite. George preferred libraries to boardrooms and books to small talk. He was shy, intensely private, and possessed an intellect that his more socially ambitious siblings found at various times peculiar and embarrassing. What George did with his share of the Vanderbilt fortune was not invested in railroads or banks. He became educated, truly deeply comprehensively educated in ways that had nothing to do with formal credentials and everything to do with genuine curiosity about the world. By the time he was in his 20s, George spoke 8 languages fluently: French, German, Italian, and others he had learned not from tutors in parlor rooms, but by actually living in Europe for extended periods. He could read ancient Greek. He studied art history, architecture, agriculture, and forestry, with the focused attention of a scholar who intended to use what he learned rather than simply demonstrate that he had learned it. His personal library eventually grew to more than 23,000 volumes, one of the largest private book collections in America. And these were not books bought by the yard to impress visitors. George had read them and annotated them in multiple languages. His brothers thought he was wasting his time. Society columnists called him peculiar. George did not appear to care. Throughout his 20s, he traveled extensively through Europe, not as a tourist moving between famous sites, but as a student of how civilization had organized itself across centuries. He walked through the great chateaux of France's Loire Valley, Chambord, Chenonceau-Blois, studying their architecture, their relationship to the surrounding landscape, the way they combined grandeur with livability. He visited the country estates of English nobility and observed how they managed vast landholdings across generations. He toured Italian palazzos and German castles. And somewhere during these travels, a vision began to form. What if he could create something in America that rivaled the great estates of Europe? Not a copy, but something genuinely new, combining European sophistication with American ambition, a place that would demonstrate what American wealth could achieve when directed toward beauty and learning, rather than conquest and accumulation. In 1888, when George was 26, he visited Asheville, North Carolina for the first time. His mother was in poor health, and the family had come to the mountain town, which was developing a reputation as a health resort, seeking relief in its clean air and moderate climate. George was supposed to be keeping his mother company. Instead, he stood on the ridge overlooking the French Broad River with the Blue Ridge Mountains rising in every direction, and felt something he had never quite felt in New York's crowded, competitive social world. He felt the possibility of something permanent. Most of the land around Asheville had been logged out, farmed to exhaustion, and abandoned. The forest that had stood for thousands of years had been clear-cut. The soil was depleted. It was, by most assessments, nearly worthless. George looked at it and saw something different. He saw potential, and he began to buy. The purchases were quiet and careful. He dealt fairly with local farmers and landowners, paying reasonable prices, rather than using his family's power to force sales, a restraint that genuinely surprised people who expected a Vanderbilt to simply take what he wanted. Over several years, George assembled an estate of 125,000 acres. That is nearly 200 square miles, an area larger than many eastern states. His family's response was consistent. He had lost his mind. His brothers were buying railroads and banks. Here was George buying exhausted farmland in the mountains of North Carolina. George Washington Vanderbilt II had money more than he could ever spend. He had chosen to spend it not on power, not on conquest, but on beauty. He just needed someone to help him build it. AC 2. Building the impossible. Richard Morris Hunt was the most prestigious architect in America in 1888, and his initial response to George's proposal was something close to polite alarm. Hunt had designed the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. He had created the palatial Newport cottages that defined Gilded Age excess at its most theatrical. He understood grand ambitions and expensive visions. But what George was proposing, a full French Renaissance chateau in the mountains of North Carolina, remote from any major city on terrain that would make construction a continuous nightmare, seemed to combine brilliant vision with complete impracticality in roughly equal measure. George was not deterred. He wanted a Loire Valley chateau, not an interpretation, not an homage, but the genuine article built with the same precision and the same quality of materials and craftsmanship that the original models had required. He wanted it large enough to house his library, his art collection, and his guests in the manner of the great European estates he had spent years studying. He also wanted it to contain every modern convenience that 1890s technology could provide. Hunt was won over eventually, and he delivered. Construction began in 1889. George was 27 years old, unmarried with no children. He was building a 250-room house for himself, his books, and a vision of what American architecture might become. His family's whispers about eccentricity and wasted fortune followed the project from its first day to its last. The scale of what was attempted is genuinely difficult to convey in words. The central spine of the house runs 780 feet longer than 2.5 football fields. The limestone for the exterior was quarried in Indiana, millions of pounds of it, cut to precise dimensions, numbered and transported by rail to Asheville, then up a specially constructed railway to the construction site itself. Each block had to fit perfectly. These walls would support the entire structure above them, and the precision required left no margin for error. The workforce at its peak numbered more than 1,000 people. But American craftsmen, skilled as many of them were, could not provide what George's vision demanded. So Hunt imported specialists. Italian stonemasons arrived from the cathedrals and palazzos where they had learned their trade across generations. They carved the limestone facade by hand, creating the ornate details that make Biltmore's exterior what it is. French artisans came to create the elaborate plasterwork in the interior rooms. Ceilings covered in intricate designs, molded and painted by hand, each panel requiring weeks of careful work before it was finished to George's standard. English woodworkers brought their expertise in carved oak paneling. Spanish tile setters installed floors designed to last centuries. These European craftsmen lived on the estate during construction, creating what amounted to a small international village on a North Carolina mountainside. They taught American workers their techniques, and in this sense, Biltmore functioned as something it was never intended to be, an informal school of old-world craftsmanship in the New World. The technology inside the house was as revolutionary as the craftsmanship outside was traditional. George wanted the authenticity of a Renaissance chateau and the comfort of a modern American home, and he saw no contradiction in demanding both simultaneously. Electricity ran throughout the building, powered by the estate's own generator, at a time when most of rural America was still lit by candles and oil lamps. Central heating required miles of steam pipes running through the walls and floors. Hot and cold running water served all 43 bathrooms. Mechanical refrigeration kept the kitchens functioning year-round. Fire alarms, an intercom system connecting servants' quarters to the main rooms, multiple hydraulic elevators, all of it was installed and working before the house opened its doors. The indoor swimming pool held 70,000 gallons of heated water and was fitted with underwater lighting, which was genuinely revolutionary technology for 1895. The juxtaposition was deliberate. George wanted to live surrounded by the beauty of centuries past, but he had no nostalgia for chamber pots and freezing bedrooms. Frederick Law Olmsted, who had designed Central Park in New York, was hired to address the landscape. Olmsted was initially skeptical the land was so degraded from decades of poor farming that restoring it to anything attractive seemed optimistic. But George's vision was larger than Olmsted had understood at first. They would not simply landscape a garden, they would restore an entire ecosystem. Olmsted designed a 3-mile approach road that would reveal the house gradually through trees, building anticipation over the final miles before the full view opened at once. He planned formal gardens close to the house, an Italian garden, a walled garden, a shrub garden, each requiring thousands of plants, many imported from Europe. Further from the house, he designed working landscapes, farms, forests, nurseries, where beauty and utility would exist together. Gifford Pinchot, a young forester who had studied land management in Europe, was hired to address the 125,000 acres beyond the formal grounds. What he and George developed together became the first example of systematic scientific forestry in American history: reforestation, sustainable harvesting, management of streams and watersheds as integrated systems. The land that George had purchased as an exhausted wasteland would be restored to productivity. Hunt would later say that working with George was both a dream and a nightmare. A dream because his client had impeccable taste, unlimited resources, and genuine understanding of what he was trying to achieve. A nightmare because George was never satisfied with good enough. If something was not right, it was redone. Cost was not the question. Quality was the only question. On Christmas Eve, 1895, George opened the doors of Biltmore House for the first time. His family and friends arrived to find something that should not have existed: a perfect French chateau sitting in the North Carolina mountains, more magnificent than anything they had seen in Newport or New York. It had taken 6 years, 1,000 workers craftsmen from 4 continents, and $6 million. George had spent the last years of his 20s and all of his 30s building something no one had asked for, and almost no one had understood. Now he had to fill it. Exit. 3. Inside the grandest rooms. Imagine arriving at Biltmore on that first Christmas Eve in 1895. You have traveled by train from New York, then by carriage up the 3-mile approach road that Olmsted designed. Through bare winter trees, you catch glimpses of towers and roof lines, teasing suggestions of what lies ahead. Then the road curves and the trees open, and there it is. Massive, impossible beautiful, rising from the mountain ridge exactly as if it had stood there for 3 centuries. Your carriage stops at the front entrance. The limestone facade rises 4 stories above you. Before you even step inside, you understand that you are somewhere unlike anywhere you have been before. The first room you enter is the winter garden. Not a formal parlor, not a receiving hall, a garden indoors with a glass ceiling flooding the space with natural light. Palms and ferns and exotic plants create a tropical atmosphere in the middle of a North Carolina winter. A fountain bubbles in the center. The floor is covered in intricate tiles. You are inside a house, but it feels like you are outside in a southern climate, and the disorientation is exactly what George intended. He wanted his guests off balance from the first moment, aware that the normal rules of what a house is and does did not apply here. From the winter garden, you are led to the banquet hall, and this is where words begin to fail. The room is 70 feet long and 42 feet wide. The ceiling rises 70 feet overhead. That is a 7-story building inside a dining room. The walls carry massive Flemish tapestries from the 16th century, each one worth a fortune, depicting hunting scenes with the particular density of detail that medieval weavers spent months achieving. A triple fireplace, 3 fireplaces built side by side, each large enough for a person to stand in, dominates one end of the room. The oak table seats 64 people. Above you, the ceiling that appears to be ancient timber construction is actually steel trusses from the 1890s, disguised in wood and plaster by craftsmen who understood that modern engineering could serve aesthetic beauty without needing to announce itself. The flags hanging from the ceiling are real battle flags from European regiments, some dating back centuries, collected by George during his travels. The chandelier is custom-made to look medieval while running on electricity. You can illuminate the entire hall with a single switch, something most Americans in 1895 cannot do in their entire homes. The library is where George spent most of his time, and walking into it, you understand why. The 2-story room holds 10,000 volumes floor to ceiling in carved walnut shelves. A painted ceiling depicts mythological scenes. Comfortable chairs are positioned to catch the light from tall windows. A marble fireplace provides warmth for winter reading. These are not decorative books. They are in 8 languages annotated in George's hand, showing decades of actual engagement with their contents. The library is a scholar's room designed for use, not display. The music room contains tapestries and a pipe organ built into the architecture. The billiard room is paneled entirely in Spanish leather. The breakfast room hangs Albrecht Dürer prints on its walls. Each room is distinct. Each carries specific treasures that George acquired because they interested him, rather than because they would impress visitors. The 43 bathrooms deserve particular mention because this is where Biltmore's modernity most visibly contradicts its medieval aesthetics. Hot and cold running water porcelain fixtures imported from Europe. Heated towel racks, tiled walls and floors. All of this in 1895, when most American homes still relied on outhouses and tin bathtubs filled from kettles. George's guests were experiencing plumbing standards that would not become commonplace in America for another generation. Running this establishment required what amounted to a small army. At its peak, roughly 80 people worked at Biltmore. They operated in a world largely invisible to the family and their guests. Separate staircases hidden behind walls. Separate dining rooms below the main floors separate entrances and exits that allowed them to move throughout the house without being seen unless they chose to appear. At the top of this invisible hierarchy was the house steward, essentially the general manager of everything domestic. Below him and the housekeeper who commanded all female servants and whose authority over the household's daily operations was nearly absolute. came layers of specialists' ladies' maids for female guests, valets for male ones, a head chef and multiple sous chefs working in those 3 kitchens, footmen who served at table and managed the public rooms, housemaids who maintained the private chambers, laundry staff who managed the staggering volume of linen a house this size produced every week. George treated his staff well by the standards of his era. Each servant had their own small room, a genuine luxury, when most domestic workers slept in shared quarters. They were paid fairly and fed from the same kitchens that served the family's guests. A reference from Biltmore's head butler or housekeeper could secure employment at any great house in America. Some servants spent entire careers on the estate, becoming part of its history, in ways that the historical record only partially captures. For those first years after Biltmore opened the house was everything George had dreamed: a center of culture and beauty, a working library, a home that demonstrated what American wealth could achieve when directed by genuine taste. The only thing missing was someone to share it with. Act 4. Edith and the Art of Survival. George Vanderbilt was 40 years old when he met her, and by all accounts, it was genuine love, not the calculated social alliance that governed most Gilded Age marriages, but actual, inconvenient, unexpected love. Her name was Edith Stuyvesant Dresser. She was 32 when they met in Paris in 1898, a widow of impeccable social standing. Her maiden name connected her to one of New York's oldest families, descendants of the last Dutch governor of New Amsterdam. She had been married briefly to an older man who had died, leaving her comfortably established. She had spent years moving through the highest social circles of Europe and America, equally at home in Paris, London, and Rome, developing a fluency in the management of privilege that came from years of observation and practice. Everything George was not. Edith was. Outgoing where he was reserved, socially confident where he was shy, practical where he was visionary. She understood instinctively how large establishments were run, having spent her entire adult life in and around them. They married in Paris in June of 1898, in a small private ceremony that was pure George, no massive society wedding, no newspaper coverage, just close family and friends. Then they returned to Biltmore as husband and wife, and the house that had been a bachelor's elaborate library became something it had never quite been before: a home. Edith did not change Biltmore physically. The house was already what George had made it. What she changed was the way it functioned. She looked at the accounts and understood immediately what George had never fully confronted: the estate was bleeding money. The construction had been expensive enough, but the operational costs were worse. 80 servants, the maintenance of 250 rooms, elaborate entertaining on a scale that matched the house's ambitions, agricultural and forestry operations that were improving, but not yet generating meaningful income. The sum of all these expenses was consuming the Vanderbilt fortune at a pace that even George's inheritance could not sustain indefinitely. Edith began making changes. Not dramatic cuts that would compromise what George had built, but careful, methodical adjustments. She negotiated better contracts with suppliers. She identified redundancies in the staff and consolidated roles without eliminating positions that mattered. She pressed the agricultural operations toward profitability. She brought to Biltmore the practical wisdom that George's artistic temperament had never quite required, and together they made the house work in ways it had not worked before. On August 22, 1900, their daughter Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt was born at Biltmore. The nurseries that had stood empty for 5 years finally had an occupant. The estate had an heir. For George, the years following his marriage were probably the best of his life. He had his library, his forests, his gardens, a wife who understood him completely, and a daughter he adored. Biltmore was finally everything he had dreamed it could be: a family home, not just a palace alive with the purpose he had always intended it to serve. The cruelty of what followed is stark in its simplicity. In March of 1914, George traveled to Washington for what was supposed to be a routine appendectomy. Complications developed on the operating table. On March 6, 1914, George Washington Vanderbilt II died. He was 51 years old. He had spent 6 years building Biltmore and 16 years living in it. He had been married for 14 years. Cornelia was 13. And Edith was alone a widow for the second time with a teenage daughter and the largest private home in America to maintain on an estate that had never quite stopped losing money. She could have sold it. Most people expected her to. Other Gilded Age families were already beginning the retreat from their great estates, overwhelmed by costs that had seemed manageable when the fortunes were growing, but had become impossible once the growth stopped. The Vanderbilt mansions in New York were already being discussed as liabilities rather than assets. But Edith had loved George, and she understood what Biltmore meant to him in a way that no one who had not actually lived with his vision could have fully grasped. This was not just a house. It was his legacy, his proof that American wealth directed by genuine taste and genuine learning could create something beautiful and permanent. It was the place where their daughter had been born and raised. And Edith Stuyvesant, Dresser Vanderbilt, was not a woman who gave up easily. She would fight to keep it whatever that took. And what it took would test everything she had. Act 5. Opening the doors. The years after George's death were a series of problems that would have defeated a less determined woman. World War I began in Europe in the summer of 1914, just months after George died. The old world he had loved and studied, the European culture that had inspired every room in Biltmore's house, was being torn apart by machine guns and artillery. The social world that had celebrated houses like Biltmore was changing in ways that went deeper than fashion. Edith took complete control of the estate's operations. Where George had managed through delegation and trust, Edith managed through direct oversight. She studied every account book, questioned every expense-demanded efficiency from every operation. The staff, accustomed to George's gentle, scholarly presence, now answered to a woman who noticed everything and forgot nothing. She reduced the staff further gradually, rather than dramatically consolidating roles and finding efficiencies that George's approach had never prioritized. She pushed the agricultural operations harder toward self-sufficiency. She closed off some of the less used rooms, reducing heating and maintenance costs, and she watched with growing concern as the social world that had sustained Gilded Age estates began to transform around her. Income taxes, once a negligible consideration, were rising steadily. Estate taxes had been introduced, creating the threat that each generational transfer of Biltmore would require selling assets to pay the government. The Jazz Age arrived and made mountain chateaux seem like relics of an embarrassingly excessive past. The great Fifth Avenue mansions in New York were being sold and demolished for commercial development. The Newport cottages were closing one by one, their owners unwilling or unable to absorb the costs of maintaining houses designed for an era that had ended. Then came 1929, the stock market crash, the beginning of the Great Depression. Fortunes that had seemed eternal vanished overnight. Even the Vanderbilt fortune, still substantial, was not immune to the contraction that swept through American wealth in those years. Income dropped, investments lost value, and Biltmore, with its massive operational costs and its agricultural operations that generated income but never quite enough income, became unsustainable in its traditional form. Edith was 64 years old. She had spent 15 years fighting to keep Biltmore alive. Now she had to make the decision that would shock what remained of Gilded Age society, while ultimately saving everything. In 1930, she opened Biltmore House to paying tourists. The family still lived there. Edith had private quarters that visitors did not access, but for $1 anyone could tour the ground floor rooms. They could walk through the banquet hall where presidents had dined. They could see the library with its thousands of books. They could stand in the winter garden and understand briefly how the other half had lived. Society was appalled. Opening your private home to strangers and charging admission was unthinkable common commercial, a betrayal of every principle of aristocratic privacy that the Vanderbilt name supposedly represented. Everything the family had stood for, the exclusivity, the cultivated distance from ordinary life, was being dismantled for ticket revenue. Edith did not appear to care what society thought. She was saving Biltmore. In 1932, she made another difficult decision. She sold 86,000 acres of the estate's land to the federal government. This land became part of Pisgah National Forest, one of the first national forests in the eastern United States. The sale provided crucial capital that helped Biltmore survive the Depression's worst years. It also reduced the estate from 125,000 acres to roughly 8,000, a fraction of what George had assembled. The grand vision of a vast, self-sufficient estate was being sacrificed to preserve the house at its center. There was a certain appropriateness to the transaction. George had pioneered scientific forestry on that land with Gifford Pinchot. Now it would be managed sustainably by the federal government, preserved for the public permanently. The land was not lost. It was transformed as Biltmore itself was being transformed. World War II brought an unexpected turn. Biltmore, remote and secure in the North Carolina mountains, was identified as an ideal repository for national treasures. The National Gallery of Art in Washington, concerned about the vulnerability of its collection to possible bombing, sent many of its most valuable works to Biltmore for storage. For several years during the war, the music room and other spaces held masterworks that would today be considered priceless, more important art, concentrated in one location than almost any museum in the world contained. It was an unlikely fate for a house that had been built to showcase one man's private collection, but it was fitting. George had believed in the preservation of beauty, and Biltmore was now serving that purpose on a national scale. Edith died in 1958 at the age of 92. She had outlived George by 44 years. She had spent nearly half a century fighting to preserve what he had built through depression and war, through social changes that made Gilded Age estates seem first excessive and then simply anachronistic. When she died, Biltmore was still standing still, owned by the family, still operating. Against every economic and social force that had dismantled every comparable estate in America, Biltmore had survived. The question was whether the next generation could do what Edith had done. A site. 6. The business of beauty. George's grandson, William Amherst Mansfield Cecil, inherited the management of Biltmore after Edith's death and faced a question that had no precedent in American estate history. The tourism that Edith had reluctantly introduced was working in the limited sense that it helped offset operational costs. But it was not enough. Property taxes on 8,000 acres and a house of Biltmore scale were substantial. Maintenance never ended. A structure this old and this large required constant attention, and the craftsmanship George had demanded meant that restoration work could not be done cheaply or quickly. The economics of operating what was essentially a small town were relentless. William Cecil could have sold. The family would have been wealthy from the transaction. Biltmore would have become, in all likelihood, a state museum or a hotel, or would have been divided and partially demolished, as had happened to so many comparable properties. Instead, he expanded. The expansion was careful and purposeful, guided by a principle that George himself would likely have recognized. Biltmore should remain beautiful, should remain authentic, should remain what George had made it while generating the income necessary to sustain itself indefinitely. A winery was established on the estate grounds. The agricultural tradition George had begun, the experimental farming, the careful land management, found a new expression in viticulture. Today, Biltmore Estate Winery is one of the most visited wineries in America, producing wines that have won awards, and that George, with his appreciation for French culture and French cuisine, would perhaps have approved. A luxury hotel was built on the estate's grounds, not inside the historic house, but in a new structure that offered 5-star accommodation while preserving the integrity of what George had built. Guests could stay on the property wake to the mountain views that had captivated George in 1888. and experience the landscape as he had intended it to be experienced over days rather than hours. Restaurants were added, gift shops, seasonal programming, Christmas celebrations that echoed George's own tradition of opening Biltmore at the holidays, spring garden tours when Olmsted's plantings reached their peak, outdoor events on the remaining acreage, corporate gatherings in spaces that had once hosted literary salons. Biltmore became a destination rather than simply a house tour, and the distinction mattered enormously to its survival. The house itself was preserved and in many ways restored beyond its original state. Modern climate control protects the art and furnishings from the humidity and temperature fluctuations that had been slowly degrading them. Fire suppression systems guard against the disaster that had destroyed so many comparable structures. The maintenance staff, still substantial, though nothing like the 80 servants of George's day, works year-round on a building that demands constant attention. What makes Biltmore genuinely unique in the modern era is not any of these specific decisions, but the principle underlying all of them. The family refused to choose between preservation and operation. They insisted that Biltmore could be both, that it could remain what George had made it, while serving a contemporary purpose, that beauty and commerce were not incompatible when the commerce was directed toward maintaining the beauty. George's great-great-grandchildren are involved in Biltmore's operation today. More than 1 million people visit every year. The winery, the hotel, the restaurants, the events together, they generate the income that the tourism receipts alone never could have. Biltmore pays its own way in a manner that no comparable property in America has managed. Consider what happened to the alternatives. The Vanderbilt Fifth Avenue mansions demolished in the 1920s and 1930s, replaced by commercial buildings whose names no one remembers. The breakers in Newport, larger and more elaborate than many European palaces given to the Preservation Society in 1972, because the family could not sustain the costs. The Marble House, Whitehall. The great Newport cottages that had defined the Gilded Age's most theatrical ambitions, frozen in time, as museums unable to pay their own bills, dependent on government support, and non-profit boards that struggled annually to justify their existence. Biltmore stands among them as the exception that proves the rule. Still in family hands, still thriving, still inspiring the people who walk through its doors with the same combination of beauty and ambition that George Vanderbilt brought to those North Carolina mountains in 1888. George built Biltmore to last. He said so himself. He spent 6 years and $6 million making sure of it. He just did not know that lasting would require not 1 generation of sacrifice and determination, but 5, and counting. Epilogue. What George would think. Stand at Biltmore's entrance today, and you will see something that should not exist. A fully operational, family-owned Gilded Age estate 130 years after it was built. The limestone facade exactly as Hunt designed it. The formal gardens Olmsted planned still maintained to the standard he intended. The forests that Gifford Pinchot restored still standing on land that was considered worthless when George began buying it. Inside the banquet hall still takes your breath away. The library still holds books that George read and annotated in multiple languages. The winter garden still blooms. The indoor pool, the bowling alley, the 43 bathrooms, all carefully maintained, all preserved as testimony to what Gilded Age craftsmanship could accomplish when the person directing it refused to accept anything less than perfect. What would George think if he could see it? He would be startled by the strangers photographing every room. He built Biltmore as a private retreat, and now more than 1 million people a year walk through it. He would be surprised by the winery, the hotel, the restaurant's commercial enterprises, in a place he conceived as pure aesthetic expression. He would likely find the gift shops bewildering. But here is what George would also recognize. The house is beautiful, maintained to standards that honor the craftsmanship he demanded. The forest he worked to restore is standing. His library is still there. The vision he carried from the Loire Valley to the Blue Ridge Mountains, a place that demonstrated what American wealth could achieve when directed by genuine taste, is not just intact, but more widely shared than he could have imagined. He built it for himself and for the guests he would invite. It turned out he was building it for everyone. Every other great Gilded Age mansion failed because its owners made one of two mistakes. They built without thinking about legacy, assuming the fortune that sustained the house would sustain it forever, or they refused to adapt when the world changed around them. The Vanderbilts of Biltmore made neither mistake. Each generation found the specific adaptation that the specific moment required. Edith opened the doors to tourists when the alternative was closing them permanently. William Cecil built a winery and a hotel when tourism alone was insufficient. The current generation manages a complex multi-revenue business that George would not have recognized in its form, but would perhaps have appreciated in its purpose. There is a lesson here that extends beyond the history of one estate. The things worth preserving are rarely preserved by doing nothing. They survive because someone decides they are worth the cost of keeping the cost in money, in effort, in the willingness to change everything about how something is used while holding on to the essence of what it is. George Washington Vanderbilt II was nothing like the other Vanderbilts. He did not want to conquer industries or social hierarchies. He wanted to create something beautiful that would last. He was right about the beauty. He was right about forever. The one thing he did not fully anticipate was that lasting would require generations of people after him, choosing repeatedly and at real cost to make it so. The 1 million visitors who walk through those doors every year are not gawking at excess. They are seeing proof that with enough vision, enough determination, and enough willingness to change everything except the thing that matters most, beauty lasts. George built a house. The house became a legacy. The legacy became a demonstration that some things, against all the evidence of history and economics and time, can actually endure.